just going back to the day, so we obviously had the first lot of workshops, so thank you Adam and Claire for feeding back on those 2 sessions that you did. Those workshops included a session around Care Act assessment versus an assessment of what's necessary and appropriate, and my colleague Anita Mottram, who's a principal occupational therapist in Kirklees, she did that assessment because again there's often confusion around you can only access the DFG via the kind of Social Care Act, Children's Act route, and that's not the case. And Anita provided did a session around that. And then Lucy, who's here, and I'll hand over to Lucy now, she did a session around the role of mop-up service. I know you don't like me calling it mop-up, but the role of those OT companies that provide the mop-up service, and how do you make those work? Because again, anecdotally, we're aware that sometimes those services don't run smoothly, but what are the opportunities to work and to do those things better? So Lucy, do you want to come in and say a little bit about your session again, what kind of some of the risks were?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, it was a really impassioned workshop that we held, and lots of opportunity for people to talk about their particular experiences of using this type of service. So as Rachel alluded to, we did discuss what we mean by a mop-up service, and it's traditionally an external agency who's used in the sort of short to medium term to reduce the wait for an OT assessment, and it comes around because of recruitment issues and increasing demand for services and sometimes limited budgets. And we talked about the pros and cons of this, and I think what some people in the room were saying, their experience of an external agency coming in and managing a waiting list or being handed cases from a waiting list, was that they felt that once that agency had withdrawn, that the employed occupational therapist had to then mop up. So we talked about that, then the perception of that being a mop-up service. We talked about the pros and cons. So we said, yes, it does give timely access to advice and assessment and recommendations. And we also talked about how often it comes about through a tender process, which sometimes has its own limitations because some commissioners will focus on cheaper services rather than those that provide value for money and a quality service. So we talked about benefits, the benefits were for the employed staff to work on processes and pathways, for the employed occupational therapy team to focus on urgent referrals. Adam and I talked about our own personal experience of speaking to staff where the morale had increased, knowing that they didn't have to think about a waiting list anymore because it was literally keeping them up at night. And obviously with some services, you can get that expert advice on cases. It's a timely approach to adaptations. It reduces, one of the main things, that the advantages that came out of the room was that people felt it reduced hospital admissions, because people waiting on a waiting list for a DFG their health can decline over time. So it was about that timely access to adaptations to reduce care packages as well. And obviously the reduction in complaints because people aren't waiting for as long for an assessment. So the challenges we talked about were that there is a difference between low cost and value for money, and these are not the same thing. We talked about the fact that if these companies fly in and reduce the waiting lists in the short term, once they withdraw, the waiting list can just build again. So we were talking about how to manage that in the long term as well. We were saying that some companies you might work with not necessarily dealing with clinicians or occupational therapists as part of the project. Sometimes companies will outsource to people who are not expert in housing. And therefore some of the recommendations that we discussed that had been made didn't necessarily fit under that legislation and the DFG necessary and appropriate. That sort of led on to talking about potentially poor quality assurance processes and the need for that good quality assurance process for the assessments. And actually, you know, when these companies come in, if they're highly skilled and have lots of experience doing it, they should be liaising with commissioners and managers about and giving some advice about pathways and how things can be improved. And that's where the OT service works with foundations closely, and has that clinical partnership, which is great. So we talked about how it can support long-term waiting list management, which I've focused on. We talked about the difference between mop-up and cleansing, because mop-up feels like you're just moving things around, but cleansing is actually a longer term thing. We talked about some of the challenges are mostly around IT and access to IT for the external agencies. We talked about the workflow, access to resources, some of the issues around GDPR and data sharing and how you get around that. And yeah, that was it really. I'm just seeing if there's anything else from my notes. Yeah, just we had some examples and some feedback of some local authorities that we work with that we shared with the workshop, some really, really positive experiences. And that was it, I think. Yeah, that was everything.
Lovely. Thank you for that feedback, Lucy. The third session I did with Kate Sheehan, and what we looked at in that session was how we define consultation. So those of you that are really familiar with the DFG legislation know that what it talks about is where you're a two-tier authority, then the housing should be consulting with social care around a particular aspect of relevant works and what is necessary and appropriate. So we had a conversation around how consultation looks. In a lot of local authority, that consultation often does look like either some type of OT assistant assessment, and actually were there other opportunities, particularly with the simple ones of doing that consultation differently, so a more light touch, and again, I think probably a lot of the conversations from the workshop kind of overlap, because obviously we looked at the use of trusted assessors in that. So that was that session around how can we look at consultation differently to help people access the DFG quicker. So that gives you a feel for the sixth session, and a huge thank you to Lucy, Claire and Adam for giving some feedback on those workshops. So if I can make my slides move. As I say, we then had a little bit of a rounding up of the sessions, and obviously we're not quite a week down the line yet, but in terms of what we've learned at Foundations, I think the key things that came and have come through for me and what we need to take forward at Foundations is that a key message from all the workshop was that need around building trust. So building trust between health, housing, social care, building trust between kind of practitioners across the DFG process. So yeah, that need, if we're going to work differently, that need to build trust. What was also really clear that came through was that, particularly for the occupational therapists, that there was a real appetite for doing things differently, for letting go and holding things differently, but that as obviously as a registered professionals, from a registration point of view, that the OTs want to feel protected and supported in terms of doing things differently, perhaps not, you know, letting go of the process earlier, having a more light touch. But if we're going to do that, I think from a Foundations perspective, it's about working with key stakeholders such as the Royal College of OT Specialist section around housing, around how we can do that well and how we can support practitioners to feel protected and safer and more supported if that we are going to do things differently. One of the things that came through was this word proportionate. So it's about always kind of taking a more proportionate response. But if we're going to take that proportionate response, I think we need to do much more work around. I appreciate that we've got trusted assessor framework, but there is something about, I think, developing clearer competencies around the skills and knowledge that are required for the different types of cases that we're working with. So being really clear about the knowledge and skills of somebody working with a case that is simple compared to compared to a more perhaps complex case. As I say, we have got the trusted assessor framework, but I think it was really evident that perhaps that needs to be a bit more robust and developed for adaptations. I think there was something around picking up from Adam's point of view. If we are going to have people like manufacturers, suppliers involved much more in the assessment process, then perhaps foundations taking a role in terms of developing some quality standards around what we think ethical practice, so almost kind of a code of conduct, I guess, for manufacturers and suppliers to kind of sign up for, so that services who might want to use manufacturers and suppliers, if they know they kind of signed up for a code of conduct. So I think there's a role that we could look at there if we're going to look at involving manufacturers and suppliers more. Again, linked to that proportionate response, there is some really good training already out there, but again, it's about that need to look at that training and training that's really focused on developing the skills and knowledge for the workforce that we need. In terms of, I mean, as regional advisors, as foundations, we're already supporting lots of local authorities to do things and manage that change process, because it's not always an easy process. So, for example, at the moment, I'm actually at a day centre in North London, because we're working with a local authority that is looking at that change process. So, so we're already doing that work, but I think it's around how we support local authorities, support teams across housing, health and social cares to build really good collaborative relationships. And I think there's some work that we can do there, building on what we already do at foundations. And also this, if we're going to do consultation differently, have different kind of pathways depending on complexity. So I think there's some work that we need to do again at foundations to unpack what the different levels of consultation looks like. And again, all these things kind of interconnect, because if we're going to do consultation differently, we need to think about kind of competencies around knowledge and training, etc. So that's what we've learned, and that's what we've taken away. So hopefully, for those that weren't at the summit, that gives you a flavour of what we did and what we covered. And Paul's not here. I think perhaps he's on a mobile phone somewhere watching us, because he's at the CIH conference at the moment. But Paul rounded off the afternoon for us, so that's Paul. So there's a lot of, as kind of Adam's alluded to, these events which we want to raise more questions than answers. We will keep you posted in terms of the progress that we're making, and we'll keep you posted through obviously our newsletter, our DFG Champions Facebook page. Hopefully it updates you on future webinars, as well as giving you feedback during the roadshows as well, in terms of how we're moving forward from the summit.